You know, I've spent 25 years in the technology industry. I've both been on the supplier side, where we've designed and developed semiconductors, and I'm on the channel side in terms of how they go to market. For 25 years, I think my family and my friends never had any idea what I did, but suddenly I'm the guy that's in between them getting their automobile, their washer, their new kitchen, and you know, the impacts in terms of technology across the board. We are in an unprecedented time. I liken it to what Dickens said, it is the best of times and the worst of times. So let me give you a little bit of context in terms of what we're seeing. The semiconductor industry is a $500 billion. This 30-year view shows that it's been moving along at about a 5% CAGR rate over time. But if you look a little bit closely, there are peaks and troughs in this. It's a mature market, it's cyclical, and it is typically impacted by broader macroeconomic events. Be that the Great Recession we had in 2008, 2009, but we also have, you know, normal events. If you look more recently, Q4 of 2018 was the last peak in the semiconductor industry. Normally, we have about 8 quarters of expansion, and then we have about 4 quarters of correction. 2019 was supposed to be one of those slowdown periods, a normal correction in the industry, and it was. Except 2 things happened that really had a profound impact relative to what was going to be the supply chain over the next 2 years. First, in 2019, sanctions started to get imposed on some technology companies based in China. Huawei was perhaps the most impacted. That sent shockwaves through the Chinese market that potentially other companies were going to get impacted, and therefore through 2020, they remained hyper-vigilant around supply and started to acquire heavily. 2020 became a growth market again, except it wasn't normal. It was interrupted by COVID. And if you take a look at how COVID really impacted, hey, China was started to be hit aggressively and hard through the middle to Q4 of 2020. We in the West didn't really go into a COVID lockdown until Q1, Q2 of 2021. China, as they came out of COVID, started to buy aggressively. Demand for semiconductors went through the roof. And by the time we in the West started to come out in Q2 of 2021, lead times had already expanded dramatically. The automotive industry really only woke up in Q2 to find that lead times had already doubled in the industry. The industrial sector was also following suit. So much so that if you take a look at beyond this correction in 2019, which should have been about 4 quarters, hey, it felt in the West more like a 8-quarter correction. It was actually the longest downturn we've ever had in the semiconductor industry. China reacted faster and quicker. As it went into 2021, and we started to experience a growth cycle, let's face it, nobody had planned for it. And I'll give you some perspective why in a second. But let me give you some broader context. When I listened to the Economist presentation this morning, you're right to take certain positives away from it. I do view that we are in for a golden era of demand over the next decade. Every application is getting digitized, hyper-connectivity, extremely secure, and applications and software for experience and remote management is going to blossom. However, all of that is going to be curtailed by supply. Supply is going to struggle to keep up with demand. And we believe that what has been a 5% CAGR over the last 30 years is likely going to look more like a 10% CAGR over the next decade. And what is a $525 billion market is going to get close to a $1 trillion semiconductor market by 2030. But it's not going to be even. Certain segments, certain technologies are going to get served more with greater supply, while other technologies and other segments are going to remain constrained at least through the next 5 years. At least through the next 5 years. So, how do we get it so wrong? When you take a look at where we were as an industry, especially in the West, who didn't have any color or impact around sanctions like China had, hey, we were already in this downturn in 2019, and frankly, economists were unsure what the impact of COVID was going to be. Most called for it being a prolonged recession. There was big debate about whether this was going to be a U-shaped recovery, a W recovery, but very few, if any, had confidence it was going to be a V-shaped recovery. What we ended up with was maybe us thinking that, yeah, 2020, 21, maybe we'll see a return to a 5, 6, 7% growth rate. What we ended up with is 2021 grew 29% versus 2020. In fact, if you take a look at 2020, 2021, and now 2022, this is going to be a 3-year growth cycle. A 3-year growth cycle has only occurred 3 times in the prior 30 years in this industry. We would normally be looking at a correction or a downturn in this market right now. So when you look at the longevity of these upturns, typically they're only interrupted by a macroeconomic shock. So we're all watching to see what inflation, what the war may have impact relative to demand. It's unclear. But if demand stays at current levels, we're actually not going to see equilibrium in supply or demand for the next years, 2, 3, maybe even 4 years. You're going to see improvement, but not recovery. It's actually going to take probably an economic downturn to free up some demand so we can get to a little bit of equilibrium in the sector. How did we get it so wrong? You know, economists really called for this could be the recession to really trump them all. There was calls for a significant amount of disruption in the labor market in what is a heavily services industry, from tourism to the hotel, travel sectors, but even back into education. People having to work from home. Nobody really projected that we would actually be able to manage as well in a remote work environment. We had never tried it before. So the view was that the labor shocks were going to be much greater, and therefore the impact in our purchasing power was going to be huge. And if you take a look at the impact in terms of us taking down spending on electronic products, from PCs to tablets to mobile phones to all of the gadgets we like, the view was it was going to be down somewhere between 10 and 25% depending on the product. So let me give you a little bit of perspective on the supply side of things. So in the semiconductor world, the world is divided into 2 kinds of wafers. A wafer is a thin disk, and it comes in 2 sizes predominantly, an 8-inch or 200 millimeters, or a 12-inch, 300 millimeters. The big difference is how many die or chips you can get per wafer. The 200 millimeter technologies have been around for many years, and you tend to have what's called legacy or mature nodes in those. Typically nodes that we kind of call older than 28 nanometer. You might hear 28 nanometer, 0.18, 90 nanometer, and so on. 300 millimeter is where you're seeing the most advanced cutting edge nodes. You'll hear a lot about 10, 7, 5, and now even 3 nanometer technology. Industry and automotive is heavily biased to 200 millimeter wafers and these more mature technologies. Why? Because companies like Rockwell and others stand behind quality products that they take to market for 15, 20, 25 years. You sustain these mature technologies. However, what's happened is that there is such a large percentage of the semiconductor industry that's outsourced to manufacture. The big semiconductor companies have become not manufacturers, but original design manufacturers. And they're outsourcing to external fabs to build on their behalf. The external fabs, realizing a higher return on invested capital, have all moved to advancing towards 300 millimeter wafers in these most advanced nodes. 200 millimeter wafers actually didn't get incremental CapEx investments since 2017. It was dead flat through 2018, 2019, and only into 2021 did we see investment. But these are not new factories. This is investment in additional equipment, not new factories. And the result is, when you look at that trend plus the geopolitical one, back in 1990, most semiconductors were built by semiconductor companies in their home country. Japan, Europe, and Americas really made up most of the industry. But over the last 30 years, it shifted to China, Taiwan, and Korea. And it's really become concentrated in a very few participants. If half of the industry is outsourced, 56% of production of that outsource is now with one company, TSMC. When you add in UMC and SMIC, you get closer to about 65%. You add in Samsung, you're getting close to about 85%. Global foundries and then select participants in China make up the balance. There is no more than about 10 companies that make up 80% of the external supply. But look at what they're making product for. All of that 300 millimeter product, or these 12-inch wafers, are going into smartphones, going into the data center. And what we, Arrow and companies like Rockwell, are really engaged on in this automotive and industrial sector is really made up from that 9% in IoT, the 4% that's in automotive, and the others. And Ernest and I was talking just about how concentrated this market is. If there's 10 big companies making this stuff, hey, there's 10 big companies also consuming it. There's 10 companies now in the world that consumes 42% of all semiconductor content. If you look at companies like Apple to Microsoft to Google to AWS, companies that align with these applications, 42% consumed by 10 companies. So, when you take a look at where all this investment is going, it's actually going into these hyper-advanced nodes that really processor technology is utilizing, but not necessarily what analog, mixed signal, connectivity solutions are being utilized in the industrial market. And as all of this investment is going, you'll see where these big processing edge compute companies are taking the investment, but it's for the data center, it's for the handset, and it's for thin client. It's not for the industrial marketplace. There is a big dichotomy relative to the technologies we need and where investment's going. There is now $175 billion of CapEx announced over the next 5 years going into semiconductor. But at least $125 billion is going into these advanced nodes and for the sectors like mobile phone, data center, and networking 5G applications. So before I transition this back to Ernest, I wanted to give you some context in what does this really mean for you in the room. Semiconductor backlog since Q4 of 2020 has gone up 3x. We used to typically get from our customer base a maximum of 2 quarters of visibility. We are now getting over 2+ years of visibility. Lead times have tripled since Q4 of 2020. Most digital technologies, microcontrollers, FPGAs, even high-performance analog, we're now looking at 50 to 70 weeks. And suppliers are actually going out to TSMC and others to book capacity for at least the next 2 to 3 years. They are paying a premium to do so. But if they're booking capacity 2 to 3 years out, they're guessing what demand might look like. They're coming back to the market to look for commitments from us to make sure that we're buying into 2 to 3 years of visibility. That means visibility from all of us touching customers needs to increase. Looking at your customers' CapEx cycles, they're going to have to start planning in terms of how long of a visibility they make. But even though they're planning 3 years out, it is so tight with so much delinquent demand right now that they're actually making allocation decisions in 90-day windows. And the churn of their decisions, what they may communicate in one given month, may change 90 days later. And that's what Ernest and I have been working through. So how we plan to work with our suppliers to transition off of legacy nodes to more advanced nodes means there is a delay in how the industry is transitioning to 300 millimeter and these newer nodes. But we do have to engage with suppliers now relative to that NPI planning and what it's going to mean to new products as well as sustaining existing products. You're going to have to work relative to understanding the roadmaps, not just of how they're introducing products, but in what factories, what wafer size, and what geometries. But I did want to give you some perspective that even though it may have felt tight, when we look at the work we've done with Rockwell Automation secured 1 billion units of incremental supply in 2021, all of which was unforecasted coming into the year. That is tremendous performance in terms of supply, but it's uneven. There's pockets that are still late, still being expedited. We're looking at more inventory of some stuff and complete undersupply of others. And this imbalance is going to continue for a while. We are working through long-term agreements around supply together and negotiating that with the supplier base and how we hold more product at the semiconductor level, WIP, and even in finished product. And we're looking for sustaining collaboration around engineering to determine, hey, what changes can we make in software? What changes can we make in hardware to make sure that products that are in high volume but impacted by supply have some contingency and alternatives? Ernest, let me turn it back to you.
I appreciate that. Look, I feel like I learn something every time we chat. So I appreciate the walkthrough relative to semiconductor industry. I truly and honestly do. What I hope the audience grasp is just a sense for the complexity here and the intricacy. This is much more than just a short-term supply issue. This is gonna honestly modify the way we design product, how we redesign product, how we think about continuation engineering quite a bit. So I need you to keep that in mind as I walk through what I say are these next couple of slides. At the same time, my perspective, unlike others that are presenting, is a little bit different, right? Yesterday you heard Brian Shepard talk about Henri, right? I'm a consumer of our product. I don't market it, I don't sell it, and if they tried to get me to market or sell it, it probably wouldn't go so well. But at the same time, I don't design it either. So in being a consumer and supporting the supply chain, my perspective is significantly different. When I think about the automation sector and what all of this has meant for us, the growth is very real, right? What has the pandemic done? The pandemic volatility has just unleashed what I'd say is just an unrelenting amount of supply chain uncertainty. Executives everywhere, including my peers, are apprehensive about what's next. They continue to ask me, Ernest, what's next? What are we doing? How are we preparing ourselves? What are we doing for the organization? And the reality is, these items that I have listed underneath the automation sector of nearshoring, of onshoring, product line moves, plant refootprinting, all of that's real. All of that is resilience. All of that's in the name of being prepared for whatever is next. Internally, we like to call it insurance. And the big question is how much insurance is wanted or needed. But in the essence of that spirit of insurance, Rockwell is a direct beneficiary. So the growth is real. We're excited. It's an exciting time for Rockwell. And contrary to some people's belief, it's an exciting time for the supply chain function. While we are dealing with the shortfall of the semiconductor industry, we're seeing unprecedented growth that we've never experienced, not at all in my time in Rockwell. This level of growth, this level of expansion, laying the infrastructure for what will be the next 10 or so years of how we function, to me is critical and it's exciting. But at the same time, I don't want to lose sight of, we're amidst a lot of chaos. And I wanted to unpack just very briefly how we got here and just talk about the elements of how we got here. I often reference a SCORE model. Many of you have heard me talk about the SCORE model in several different instances. I will walk through plan, source, make, deliver. Here I walk through it at a much higher level, just to kind of talk through the things that we're experiencing. Right? The first thing that Aiden mentioned, unprecedented, unforecasted demand. What has that meant for us? We have to grow our capacity substantially. Again, look at the company that we were. Before the pandemic, $6.6 billion company, 6.3, and now $7 billion company. Yes, we've had some acquisitions, but the reality is we're well on our way. I think many of you know last quarter, our run rate for the quarter in terms of orders had us at a $9 billion company. So the portion of that I'm responsible for in supporting our hardware continues to grow very aggressively. So we've just got to think differently and continue to think differently about how we're going to support that. So we have an organization that is solely focused on expanding that capacity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Besides that, Aiden shared with you that 50 to 70 weeks. At the start of the pandemic, we were in the low 20s on average. I've often shown a chart that shows on average we've kind of plateaued about 40. But the reality is with components right now, I'm getting commit dates from OEMs that are in 2024. And so you think about whether it's a new product, whether it's an existing product, this is the dilemma in trying to provide a legitimate date. There are things we know where the commitments have been consistent, and there are things, quite honestly, into the future we don't know. You know, and to some extent, we're taking some educated guesses. We're leveraging the broker market wherever we can to try to make things happen to be certain that we can support our customers. From a manufacturing perspective, I can openly tell you, initially, we had a lot of challenges with labor. We had to raise our wages, just like everyone else, significantly. But probably what's rearing its head now is the amount of stranded inventory. You know, Aiden mentioned this whole idea of having a little bit of a lot of things. That's essentially where we are. I can tell you there are so many products, I've got 98% of the bill of material, or even 99%, and I need that one electronic component, but it's coming in a quarter. Frustrating to say the least, but the reality is we can't support our customers to the level which we want, given that situation. And lastly, from a transportation perspective, delivery-wise, we've been consistently re-engineering our lanes to try to take this away from a volatility perspective. All of this has been significant. We've made a lot of changes. I think many of you know we got off of ocean freight and went specifically to air freight. Even air freight-wise, we've been re-engineering and redesigning our lanes as needed, just because the challenges still exist. As long as commercial planes aren't flying at the rate of which they were, you're strictly using a lot of freight forwarders, and you're using a lot of dedicated freight lanes, and that just means more expense. So all of that comes into play, and all of these are very, very dynamic variables that have me think about, how do I reinvent? And this reinvention has to happen on the fly. And that's part of the challenge, right? The plane's moving, it's going very fast. Somehow find a way to change it and make it go faster. And when I think about what elements are right for Rockwell, I've talked about these before. There's a slight twist here. You know, we knew for some time that the whole notion of this lean supply chain, turn the towel dry, get as much productivity and optimize as much as possible was going to have to go. We don't have the leverage in the marketplace to allow us to do kind of a just-in-time thinking. We had to think differently. If I go back just 4 years ago, before the semiconductor challenges, we had challenges with MLCCs that many of you may remember, multi-layer ceramic capacitors. That in and of itself had us thinking differently. It introduced this whole idea of agility, and you see this definition I have here of ensuring the right cost, service, and quality given internal decisions and external macroeconomic factors. Internal decisions is our strategy. That's Blake's strategy. That's the business strategy. That's the sales strategy. The external decisions is the macroeconomic environment. There we thought about strategic buffering. You know, we thought about how do we orchestrate the supply chain better. And when I say strategic buffering, we were putting things in place. I mean, thus far, I'll knock on wood, you haven't heard us talk about we're short in MLCC. Because the actions we put in place relative to redesign, relative to long-term agreements, were a lot of what Aiden mentioned, and it's allowed us to not have significant challenges there thus far. The reality is, even if I take a step back to the start of the pandemic, we tried to buffer for electronic components, knowing there'd be some form of snapback. We really did. And when I give you an idea of that, we put in an extra $30 to $35 million of electronic components. Our thought was, we saw that in China, kind of a four-week snap. We said, okay, we'll put 6 to 7 weeks on the shelf. We did, and many of you remember we had the downturn in our demand, and it quickly took off. And that took off, we ate through that so quickly, it was embarrassing, like we didn't even have it there. The reality is we're thinking differently about agility. So yes, we were on the offense with agility, but what quickly happened at the beginning of the pandemic, we had to go on defense, and that's where resiliency came in. That's where we think about manufacturing redundancy. We think about protection of supply, and how do we just be certain that we get some supply. So it forced us to think differently, but I want to call to your attention what happened at the beginning of the pandemic. Within days and weeks, I unraveled years of lean manufacturing in our factories. Within weeks, I unraveled years of inventory optimization, formulas that we've been put in place. Within weeks after that, I unraveled years of globalization as we started to think about redundancy and how we position given all the different challenges that we have. So all of that unraveling just means more buffers, more lead time, which is why you see I've introduced velocity. The reality is we continue to talk about lead times, what it means for us. I can tell you before the pandemic, both of my peers were at the time talking about how we need to be more market competitive in terms of lead time. I've completely gone in the opposite direction, as many of you know, all through the pandemic. We're going to have to put that back in place. I fully realize we're not competitive, and I think as we add capacity, you'll see that is what we're targeting, is to get back to market competitive lead times with our inventories back in place. As I talk about how we achieve those outcomes, we as an organization have put together this kind of three-part approach, and we're looking to accelerate it. And while internally I'll often reference it as capacity expansion, it's really a mini transformation. It starts with our digital transformation, and I'll often say, I've got to be faster to the right decision. And that right decision for me are all built into those logos that you see. We're using EDA Open for visibility. We're using GAIN systems for inventory optimization, and what I'd say is advanced planning or distribution requirements planning. Our distribution logic is housed in GAINs. We're using LlamaSoft for network design. Where do we position? How do we position? How should we think about our footprint? And then our own Factory Talk Innovation Suite is the core. It's digitizing our lean manufacturing core within our plants. As I move further, we talk about design for excellence. This is where we're building in these guidelines around resiliency, these guidelines that very much so get at what Aiden talked about relative to these now shorter life cycles, this new technology, and the way things are going to move into the future. It's going to substantially change our outlook. We used to wait for an OEM to say, you know, I don't have it anymore. We last time buy it, and we work our way through until the next design was ready. Given the changes that Aiden is mentioning, we can no longer do that. And that's going to require, quite honestly, our business units, our design teams, to think and act differently. So we're in the process of honestly modifying how we think about this. We're changing our business processes, and we're trying to drive, I'd say, the right motivation into our engineering teams to be certain that we're balancing our thinking here so that we don't overshoot what could be, honestly, a substantial change for us relative to how we invest into the future. This last piece, and I call it debottlenecking because there's a fortunate element to this that we have. Several of our competitors have had to add rooftops, right? You think about capacity expansion, it's either rooftops or it's debottlenecking. We've been fortunate that we had enough rooftops, we had enough space. Everything is debottlenecking. So yes, we're investing, we're putting quite a bit of capital into our facilities, but honestly, no rooftops are needed yet. We've got a threshold that once we cross, we're gonna have to think a little bit differently as to when we need an additional rooftop. But for now, for us, it's still all about debottlenecking. It really is. Before I jump into how we're gonna close, I wanted to at least talk about resilience because I think it's significant in the world of supply chain maturity. It is single-handedly redefining what this means to be a mature supply chain. You know, I have a couple comments here, and this first one, this past precedent, not justifying this level of contingency planning. You know, I mentioned earlier that we're not going to turn the towel dry, but this ultra lean, mathematically optimized, the operations research guys kind of going crazy, that's over, right? We know we're going to have to function differently moving forward as an organization. At the same time, off to the right, this is going to be a team sport. The supply chain strategy in any organization is there to complement what is the business and sales strategy. It doesn't stand alone. So as we're working through what I'd say is execution, as we're working through availability, there's still elements of the business strategy and the sales strategy that have to change, right? As I work with my peers, with Brian as well as with Fran, we talk about the redesign effort that has to go on. We talk about our customers that may have to redesign because of our availability woes. At the same time, as I talked to Scott General from a sales perspective, market intelligence is key. It's critical here. Where's the market going to shift? How is it going to shift? Because I don't have the availability just to put product on the shelf. So we're going to have to focus it in one way, shape, or form. But all of that comes into resiliency and how we think about this organizationally. With that, Aiden and I now are going to take a little bit of time. We only have a couple slides left, and I know we're short on time. But just to talk through our view on how it ends. Aiden?
Ernest, thanks. You know, we talk a lot about the bullwhip effect in the industry. And if you take a look at the supply chain and how it's fragmented out, the signal amplifies as it goes. There's also a real delay in terms of how this gets communicated and how it's reacted to from an investment perspective. But it's not just the current constant demand signal that's coming in that's sustained at a very high level. We also have a large amount of delinquency in the industry. And in fact, delinquency has not reduced. Nobody is canceling backlog. It's continued to sustain and it's continuing to increase.
With that, my point on this amplification, think about just what it means from a systemic perspective. If I give you a small example of something that consumes 10 a week with a 5-week lead time, at any point in time, you've got 50 on order. If that lead time extends to 10, you get 100 on order. Well, what happens when we catch up? When we catch up, I get a little concerned because that goes back down to 5. If I move that too quickly, if the different tiers of the supply chain move that too quickly, you're letting the air out of the balloon a little too quickly. And that will be a big concern relative to what we have to deal with. So the bullwhip effect is definitely something to be concerned about. It's something to watch because we do have that in our backlog. I'd be lying to say we don't. There's been panic buying, there's been hoarding, there's been safety stock increases, all of which are separate from what I just gave in that example, that continue to amplify this effect throughout the entire supply chain. So definitely of concern. Our view as we talked, both he and I, we think this is going to continue. You know, his early comments were that the supply isn't going to get better. And until the supply starts to improve, we'll see this bulb effect continue. So with that, we'll shift to the next phase of recovery, so please.
Yeah, as I said earlier, look, you're going to see areas of improvement. Investment has gone into place, but there is a lag effect. You know, a modern 300 millimeter fab costs directionally about $10 billion. And from the time you lay the first brick to having a high yield in terms of output is about 4 years. When you take a look at the delays we're seeing around equipment that's going in, hey, that may be extending the cycle a little bit. But many companies made investments early in 2019 and 2020. We are going to see some improvements in 2023. However, it's going to be imbalanced supply, and certain things are going to remain with long lead times. And we view that unless there is a demand correction or shock, we're going to remain in a highly constrained environment going into at least 2024 and potentially beyond. So product availability is going to remain a challenge. Inventories are going to continue to grow in terms of semiconductor, work in progress, and finished goods. But you know, I think Ernest has got some really good points around customer service, and I'll layer on some of those too.
Sure. What I want to be certain I share, this again is our single largest problem. We've installed and will have installed enough capacity to support, I'd say, the infrastructure to be a $9 billion company by the end of our fiscal year. And I'm comfortable and confident to say that, given the capital expenditures, given what we'll have in play. Without components, we won't see this improvement in product availability. That comes first before the inventory or customer service. Our view on recovery, again, given that supply will get better, is that late this year into what you see as 2024 plus, we'll start to see this recovery. It's going to be a tail, and it's going to happen very intermittently. Certain product lines will improve, others will not. Certain elements of product lines will improve, others will not, until we finally get to this equilibrium. And I'll take this last section because I started to talk about this new supply chain. And the reality is we've already pivoted from what was that lean supply chain that I mentioned earlier. We had elements of this agile. A lot of what we're doing is this agile and resilient. And we're looking to see how we finish so that we can get back to the velocity that we're accustomed to. So that's ongoing. And it will be ongoing as we move forward.